Hello, thank you. First of all, what a good idea to have a conference in Austin in February. Thank you, Anaconda. I like to think of this as my thesis slide. So the box, this is the status quo in Washington, D.C., and in most policy analysis around the country is proprietary modeling. And so almost every policy decision that gets made, whether it's regulatory analysis or tax policy analysis or what's the cost and benefit of building a new highway, they're all being analyzed with proprietary modeling, most often within government. And open data science is, what would you call that? Maybe a bone cudgel? Open data science is the bone cudgel that can open up analysis and make it more accessible to the public. And I have some good news for you. Yes, some of you are raising your eyebrows saying, what's the good news with these guys on the screen? Well, the good news is that both of them, their tax modeling teams, are using open source modeling powered by Anaconda to make decisions about tax policy. And in particular, what they're using is an application that the Open Source Policy Center, along with quite a few contributors from all over the place, including Continuum, have been working on. And here's just a little example of what TaxBrain does. If you can look here in the very bottom, I've doubled the size of the standard deduction. So it's tax filing season. I'm assuming you all know what the standard deduction is. We're going to double the size of the standard deduction from $6,350 to $12,700 for single families. And then TaxBrain allows you to see what's the impact on revenues. It's about $1.2 trillion of revenue loss over 10 years, assuming that there's no change in the behavior for taxpayers. Now, the cool thing is actually what happens in between the inputs and the outputs. For you guys, I think the cool thing is what happens in between the inputs and the outputs. And that is, we run some open source models for tax policy analysis. One of those is a model called Tax Calculator. One of them is a model called Tax Data, which provides the data for Tax Calculator. And then even the web application here is open source. And before going into why I think this is a better strategy for policy analysis, I'm going to tell you a little story about how we got here, how the Open Source Policy Center came to be, and why an open source approach makes sense. So back in 2012, I was working with Congressman Nunes. He's a congressman from California. He's on the Ways and Means Committee, and so his job is to write tax policy. Working with him on this tax bill, it's called the ABC Tax Act. And I thought it was a pretty good tax policy because I was working on it. And we designed it in 2012. We wanted to know what's going to be the impact on the federal budget. We want to know, is this going to raise revenue? Is it going to lose revenue? We were designing it from scratch. And so when we were designing it, we actually wanted to design it to meet some objectives, to meet some quantifiable objectives. And thankfully, there are a number of organizations in government who are supposed to help us do that. And so Congressman Nunes, in this case, it's tax policy, so it's the Joint Committee on Taxation. In this case, Congressman Nunes, he went to the Joint Committee on Taxation, and he said, can I have an estimate of the revenue impact? Because I want my bill to be revenue neutral. I don't want it to add to the debt. I want it to be revenue neutral. Give me an analysis. Unfortunately, these are all black box analyses conducted by these agencies. So the first problem that we ran into was this bill, was another bill called the Built for Growth Tax Plan. So not only did it have a cooler name than the ABC Tax Act, it also was proposed by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dave Camp at the time. And the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee ranks higher than Devin Nunes, who is not the chairman. So this came first in terms of priority for the Joint Committee on Taxation to analyze it. And so we had to wait. We had to wait about a year to get an analysis. There was some talk, and I'm not sure whether this is true, but there was some talk that Dave Camp went to the committee and said, can you take a little bit longer analyzing my bill because I don't want this other competitor I don't want this other competitor bill who's going to be distracting media attention from my bill. But either way, it took a long time because there was only one modeling resource, the Joint Committee on Taxation, and they were doing this first. The second problem that we ran into relates to these. This is an estimate. It's not an estimate of the ABC Tax Act, but this is what an estimate from the Joint Committee on Taxation looks like. You get an analysis over 10 years of the impact on the debt of your proposal, and then sometimes they'll be nice and they'll give you a footnote that breaks down that line item into a few separate subcategories. This is it. You don't get the methodology. You definitely don't get the code. You don't get a list of assumptions that they used. You don't get anything. This is what our policymakers are relying on when they're writing policy. It looks fairly similar in other policy areas besides taxes. This is what the tax one looks like. In our case, one of these line items was for over $1 trillion for the ABC Tax Act. And we had no idea what it meant. The description of it, the English description, didn't make any sense. I was working with my colleague, Alan Viard, who's the most brilliant tax expert I've ever met. He had no idea what it meant. Congressman Nunes's staff had no idea what it meant. I am not really a slouch at tax analysis, and I didn't know what it meant. So there's a line item over $1 trillion. We didn't know what it meant. What I would have liked to have done is gone into their code and looked to see how that number was generated, and then I would know what it meant. But I couldn't do that because they're black boxes. So instead, we went and asked them, and they didn't tell us, and we still don't know. So $1 trillion, where do you go? I don't know. What's the problem? They're black boxes. So there was this story. There were many that were similar, many similar cases where either I'd been involved or I heard people who were involved. I was a tax policy analyst. I wanted to advise people on tax policy, but I couldn't because I didn't have access to these models. And so we started the Open Source Policy Center. And the idea is to make open source models, make them available to the public for analyzing policy. And it's good because we've developed a few tools for doing this: individual income taxes, business taxes. Members of the community are working on a big project for welfare and transfer policy to look to see what happens when you change things like food stamps or Social Security, what happens to the economy and to different people in the economy when you do that. And then we have a project that's coming down the pipeline for analyzing things like universal basic income. And the reason why this has been such a valuable approach, one of the big reasons is because there are so many great resources that we can tap into when we're following the open source approach. And so we use Numba, we use NumPy, we use Pandas, we use all of these tools that are open source. We use all of these tools that are designed to help open source projects like GitHub and Travis CI. And this set of resources, many of which, thanks to Anaconda for developing, have been able to dramatically improve the quality of the modeling that we provide. Now, the other big resource that we've tapped into is the passion of the crowd. And so it turns out that there are a lot of people around the country who really care about public policy, who care about the decisions that their government is making, and they want to provide their expertise and their passion and their talent to making policy better. And those people have been a tremendous help for this project. And I don't know if this guy with the beard is here in the room, but if he is, I want to get you a beer because you look awesome. The other big thing that the communities provide is they've helped us find a lot of bugs. And I mean, we talk about this over and over again in the open source world, and it's true. We're able to find a lot more bugs because it's having a lot more eyeballs in the project. And I know from our project that we find bugs in policy modeling. I know that there are bugs in the proprietary modeling outfits, and they just don't get found. And I want to find the bugs because if we don't, then we're going to make policy decisions based off of flawed analyses, and those policy decisions that the federal government are making are influencing millions and millions of people, literally everyone in the country for something like tax policy. The other areas that where the open source approach has been helpful is that there are bugs that are baked into the policy budgeting system. And so one of those bugs, for example, is that there's a 10-year budget window. If a policy influences the budget outside of the 10 years, doesn't matter. If it influences the budget within the 10 years, it does matter. There are a lot of different examples where there are these problems baked into the budgeting system. When the models are proprietary, only the 10-year analysis gets conducted. The analysis only gets conducted along certain dimensions. If it's open, then someone can look over a longer horizon. We can get around these budgeting gimmicks that policymakers use so often. Another area is in the sensitivity of the models. This is a lot to digest. Don't worry about digesting everything. The key here is that we put through our models a provision from a recent policy proposal, which was to put a new tax on income over $5 million. So all income over $5 million, there'd be a new tax placed on it. If you take a fairly crude approach and you assume, like we did earlier, that there will be no changes in taxpayer behavior, then you get the chart on the left. You're raising roughly $11, $12 million a year. $1 billion a year because of this policy. But if you assume that, okay, people are going to change their behavior, they might work less, they might recharacterize their income, they might delay their capital gains, they might decide to take their income in different forms, then you get something that looks like on the right. And this is just one of the estimates from the literature on this subject in the economics field, and you end up losing revenue. And it's not clear, actually, which of these is right, because a lot of work has not been done by the empirical economists to nail down what these behavioral effects should be. The reason why that work hasn't been done is because a lot of the modelers who are working in a proprietary world have not shown what the key assumptions driving their model results are. And so when we can show that these particular assumptions are so important for the outcomes, then we can show that there needs to be more empirical work done on these assumptions, and the whole field will get better. Finally, there's a very, it's very valuable for the policymakers, and this is something that I've learned from experience. It's been very valuable for them to be able to access the models when they're crafting their policy rather than just after they've crafted their policy. And so under the current system, a policymaker like Congressman Nunes would craft his tax reform, and then he'd work with the lawyers to write all of the legislative language, which is a lot of work, and then he would take it to the estimators to get an estimate. Oftentimes, the estimate will be bad, and that policy will die. It would be much better if instead they could access the models while they're working and iterate on their proposals and make them better. And that's what having the open source models allows, is it makes it so that any policymaker, anyone in the public who has an idea can freely do that. And so one example of this is that, I don't know if you remember when the Trump campaign team redesigned their tax plan in the fall. It had in the, 2 years ago, they had produced a tax plan that was insane. It wasn't even internally consistent. And then this fall, they redesigned it, and it still is very controversial, but at least most parts of it are internally consistent. The reason why most parts of it are internally consistent is that they had access to TaxBrain when they were designing it. Same thing with the Obama Council of Economic Advisors. They were using TaxBrain to analyze their policy while they were thinking about it in this fall, rather than having to take a finalized product. They would, because they're not Congress, they would take it to the Treasury Department, and they would get a score after the fact. It's much more valuable when all of these people can analyze policy ahead of time. So when I was reflecting on Peter's talk from yesterday, what I realized was that I didn't have enough quotations in my talk, so I added this. Actually, what I realized was that all of these bullets that he highlighted are exactly the keys that are driving the work that we're doing, and these are what we think are important for government. So we want our government to be transparent. We want our government to produce reproducible results. We want our government to be accountable to us, and we want our policymakers to ask better questions. And those are all the things that open source data science allows that would be able to produce better policy if they were baked into our system of governance. Now, the final slide, this is not a white box to contrast with the black boxes. This is actually just a piece of concrete. And the reason why there's a piece of concrete here is because what I've noticed is that the more we leave the quantitative decisions to specialized organizations that are sort of shrouded in secrecy, the more everyone else only can think about ideology. When we leave all of the hard decisions, all of the concrete decisions to specialists, everyone else is just ideological. And I think by opening up this process, by making these tools available, then the discussions around policy can be much more concrete. Instead of me arguing with you about is that a good policy or a bad policy, I can argue with you about is your assumption correct or is my assumption correct? And then if we can't answer that question, maybe we'll be motivated to become economists and try to answer the question. So that's all I've got. I'm really happy to take questions about the project. I'd love, we always love more contributors if anyone wants to work on the projects. And then there are also tools that you can use like TaxBrain. And I'm happy to answer anything that you got from me. Yes? Mm-hmm. So yes, we do benchmark against the black box models. If you look in the repositories, like for tax calculator, if you go in the tax calculator repository, every time we make changes, we rerun the models and produce an output of comparisons versus estimates from some of the black box models. And oftentimes, especially if you don't assume any behavior, we get pretty close results. And then if you start adjusting some of those assumptions, then the results start to diverge. And I think a direct value here, which it's not something that I'm super proud of, but it's true, is a value that this has had, is it's allowed people to kind of back out what the black box people are doing. And so if you move the dials here, you can try to guess at what the people with the black box models are doing. As far as do we vet models, it's an interesting question because the Open Source Policy Center has really tried to take a policy neutral stance to modeling. All of the assumptions that you have to make, all the defaults are set to 0. And so our users get to decide whether they think taxpayers really respond or they don't respond to changes in tax rates. And then when people are developing the models, that's up to them, what they're doing. All of the underlying models are in the public domain. They're community driven. The people who are working on them, they make the decisions about how to model things. Where OSPC comes into play is really deciding which projects to incubate and deciding which projects to make available on TaxBrain. And the decision about which projects to make available on TaxBrain or to make available through web applications usually comes down to the robustness of the underlying modeling, more so than like decisions about the validity of the modeling approach. It comes down to, are you versioning this in a way that we can then tap into via TaxBrain? The questions about the validity of the modeling, I think those are best sorted out by outside reviewers, by people, other academics, other policy analysts who can go and look at the models and decide whether they can both look at the results of the models under a range of parameter values, and they can also go in and look at every assumption that's made within the model because the code's open. And so those sorts of decisions, I think, are much better sorted out by the peer group, the community, peer reviewers in the most open sense of peer review possible than they are by some think tank in DC. And so we don't do a lot of judgment based on validity of the models. Yes? Mm-hmm. So I think the original reason why they're closed is primarily hysteresis. It's just that they didn't know what it meant to do open source modeling, and they just didn't get started that way. A lot of these shops started in the 70s, and they just weren't thinking about that distinction. And then the question, why don't they become open source now? It's because they think there are bugs in their code and they don't want people to find them. It's because they think that it would be hard for people to understand their code and it's messy, and one guy's been working on it for a long time and he doesn't want to expose it to everyone. It's because they're using proprietary languages, and they think that there's a lot of misinformation. They might think that because they're using SAS, they can't make their code open source, which is not true, but there's just misinformation there. I think in terms of, and then the question about what does this expose us to that they're not exposed to? I mean, it exposes us to people finding bugs in our work. And thankfully, I think the public, and especially the journalists who are using this and the policymakers who are using this, they understand that there are bugs in everything, and that the only difference is that they can see the bugs in ours when they find them. And so we've not had a lot of pushback about that. That's been fine. The other more important issue that a lot of people worry about and that we worry about is, well, what if someone uses a model improperly and then cites what if someone uses one of these models and then cites the Open Source Policy Center and they use it improperly, and then that gives us a bad name? That's a big concern for an organization like the Joint Committee on Taxation or the Congressional Budget Office. It's not a concern for us because they're not OSPC's models. I mean, they're all in the public domain. We can just say that it's, you're using an open source model, you used it improperly, that's your thing. The issue for Congressional Budget Office or Joint Committee on Taxation is that they don't realize that they could just make the model available to people and then step into the role of just being a user like anyone else and then not labeling it the CBO or the JCT model. They don't realize yet that there are solutions like that. So again, it's a misinformation more than real unsolvable problems. Yes.
Hello? Yeah, do you do a data assimilation or learning where you make use of large data sets?
We make use of medium-sized data sets. So there's not, these are using the very basic technique that I showed you in TaxBrain with the first simulation that we ran. We're simply just taking a micro data set of individuals, of representative of individuals in the economy. There are about 200,000 weighted records. And then we're calculating taxes on each one of them. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. And in those cases, usually those behavioral effects, the elasticities of behavior, those have been estimated separately by other modeling, by other economists. And then we will build in the ability to enter that elasticity into these models. So we're not doing the work to estimate what that behavioral effect is, but we're saying, if you think you know what this number is, you can plug it in. Yes? So our biggest challenge has been with training people. And then when training is a big challenge, I think that means that the usability of the product could improve. And so we're always just trying to make the product more usable so that when the policy analysts are deciding, do I just pull something out of the hat, or do I go generate a number? Well, it seems easier to pull it out of the hat than it is to go generate a number. We want them to decide to go generate the number instead of pull it out of the hat. And so the reason why they would decide to pull the number out of the hat instead of generating it from our tools is because our tools aren't usable enough. And so our biggest objective right now is just making the tools usable. The people in Congress, they know about this. A lot of them use it. The president's tax staff uses it. The last president's tax staff used it. So it's not, I don't think it's a matter of the people who are in current policymaking positions knowing about it. It's just a matter of making sure that they're using it when they could be. And then something that hasn't happened yet that I'd like to see happen is more public engagement, where you have some tax policy idea, you use this, you generate a link, and you send that link to your congressman. And that piece hasn't happened yet. And I think getting that, let's call it grassroots involvement, could be valuable to help change policy. And you would have never been able to do that before. So that's actually something, you being able to go and get a quantitative estimate of a policy and send it to your congressman, that's something that you would have never been able to do before, and now you can. Yes?
You mentioned that one of the benefits of this approach is we, as like a concrete mathematical model with assumptions that can help prevent yelling matches ideologically. But that the limiting factor may be some of the behavioral economics and the assumptions that go into those. What do you think could be done to in behavioral economics to reduce the room for arguments? Is it really is it at the limit of our knowledge of microeconomics and macroeconomic interactions that is holding us up now, or is there stuff that OSPC can do?
I think it's that, I think that has to improve through the channel of now the empirical economists who would generate those estimates, and now the statisticians, they can see which assumptions are important. And now that they can see which assumptions are important, we'll shift the research focus to finding stronger evidence for those assumptions. But if the models don't allow you to do sensitivity analysis and find which assumptions are important, then the researchers don't know where to focus, and they're just trying to get a paper published so they can get their darn tenure, and they're not going to focus on this. But if you show, hey, all policy decisions about tax policy are getting made based on this parameter, and that's really important, now you've shown them where to focus their efforts. And it's a long game, but I think that's the direction that needs to happen. A place like the Open Source Policy Center, yes, we could go and raise more money to try to study those assumptions more heavily, but compared to the level of resources at universities and across the country and across the world and all the people who could be doing research everywhere, I think that our impact of educating them about what's important is going to be a lot higher than our impact of trying to do that ourselves.